counter. That one dude that's going to make you hear shing every 5 seconds. Another style with a very direct and easy to apply concept, but that doesn't mean it's simple to execute. Counter is, as you'd expect, a counter-oriented style. It relies mostly on prediction, considering that it has a very high counter damage multiplier. This means it deals a very high amount of healable damage if it lands a successful counter. This is counter's primary damage output, as its base damage is quite poor. Counter is also technically an outboxer, but it overall actually has pretty well-rounded stats, meaning you can, for the most part, play how you want to. It has a decent block, a good dash that's capable of double dashing, and solid block damage, though that may be slightly below average from my general observation. Counter is very straightforward. You're going to know what you need to do from the minute the match starts. On the other hand though, it's also really technical in the sense that you have to be constantly scanning your opponent for obvious repeated strategies and techniques, like feinting or general types of strings. Since all of your DPS comes from your counters, recognizing these is how you're going to make progress. Because of all of this, counter has a pretty high skill floor to begin with, but practicing consistently and figuring out how to read people the quickest will bridge that relative gap. On top of that, you've got more than just the counter tool working for you. Your swings are above average in speed, and the counter damage on your heavy swing, if landed, is absolutely obscene at times. Counter is really good at coming back from bad scenarios because of its potential for a snowball effect. That is, dealing multiple of its specialized counter hits in a row has the power to level the game if you're losing. Because of these hits though, people might be very scared to throw a wild punch against you to begin with. You may find in higher ranked matches that people will be consistently walking left and right around you rather than trying to swing so they can perfect dodge. That's their only surefire way of hitting you without risking being hit back twice as hard. You may have to play the patient or a kind of poking game with counter more often than not, but that's pretty much exactly what it's suited for. Its range isn't that crazy in comparison to other lengthy styles like Ghost, but you can still whiff punish and keep distance with good results. Fast reaction time is also just a generally good benefit to have with counter, as it can help you get counters on heavy swings if you can teach yourself to always swing at them. You will almost never get countered yourself as counter as long as you're playing smart and not recklessly. Despite its well-roundedness, you are not an infighter, so don't try to act like it. While skill and coordination are certainly key to playing counter, it can still get very frustrating to play even if you've mastered both. Due to counter's low base damage and chip damage, as well as a pretty average level of anti-heal, simply an opponent blocking can stop you in your tracks. If they also just manage to generally play more patient than you and also have the skill to dodge your light swings, the match can tumble out of your hands as you lose your main way of fighting back. If this starts to happen, take the time to regroup. Focus on your neutral game more than your offensive game. Prioritize whiff punishing and perfect dodging until you feel like you have the match back in your hands. This can generally be said of any style, but counter benefits off of this much more than normal considering how much it relies on the snowball effect, like we touched on before. If you're the one getting snowballed instead, counter doesn't even really have the strength to get out of it or fight back unless you move backwards, since counter works best when you prioritize prediction and not aggression. This can be a difficult thing to balance, as I discovered while playing the style myself for this footage, but it's entirely possible. If you can settle into a kind of boxer-puncher form of fighting, meaning you can move in and out of aggression and defense easily, it just makes it that much easier for you to understand what your opponent tries to do. If you back up and they consistently forward dash towards you, that's when you know to swing for that counter damage. Do they feint every time you're looking for a whiff punish? That's when you get your heavy swing out to deal a huge surprise attack. Throwing the heavy swing out at random times can also be helpful if you're looking to break your opponent's illusion of control. Maybe that's a stupid tip, but oh my god, that thing hurts so bad. It's like you're moving along on a tricycle and then get flattened by an 18-wheeler. If you're in a high skill level game, you have to be aware of the fact that your opponent is going to know what you're trying to do. They're going to do their best to mix up their gameplay, but every player has habits you'll see often if you're specifically searching for them, like we touched on. Regardless of that, generally do your best to avoid standoffs or moments where you know your opponent is trying to stall or perfect dodge you. That's when you have to move back and reassess. Just because you're watching your opponent for predictions doesn't mean that they're not doing the same thing. You need to be just as on your toes to land those taps that'll move you forward. Feinting is a solid option, especially if your opponent is a heavy swinger, since they'll likely eat a counter from your light swing follow-up. Of course, this comes with the mandatory warning of do not spam your feints. It won't work forever, and if these hits don't land counters to begin with, you'll barely have managed to hurt their block afterward. If you want to get decisive swings off, finding a good pace and settling on it is also a great benefit. When I say this, I mean generally keeping the speed of the match in your hands. You should be the person controlling if your opponent is moving into an offensive or defensive state. Forcing them into this position is how you read them, start your snowball effect, and get your dodges in to secure all that damage. If you're not the one in control, it's not like you'll perform horribly, but it's another thing to tack onto the list. In the end, counter is fully dependent on how much the user is willing to be patient and decipher what their enemy is trying to do. Sprinting inward and blindly swinging won't yield what you want it to, especially considering there are better styles for that. While not as much of a rangy tapper, counter is certainly a style that solidly falls into the outboxing category. Play speedy, play smart, and play hard, and your opponent will be on the ground before they can even blink. It's the ultimate king of the snowball effect, and you should always remember that. I think I've said the snowball effect by like 8 times by now, but I gotta drive that point home. With this totally flawless guide, now finished by me, Dave Pyramid, I'm sure you'll be a RAIJIN in like 4 seconds. Hope you learned something, and peace out.